Last time on Merid and Karen, we set the scene. Morgantown, West Virginia, the home of West Virginia University, 1970. Illegal gambling, several prominent unsolved murders, and the attempted assassination of a local prosecutor are making the city feel unsafe. On a cold, snowy night, two freshman girls named Merid Mallorik and Karen Farrell head downtown to see a movie. They decide to hitchhike from the theater back to their dorm and are seen getting into what is described as a cream-colored sedan. They are never heard from again. Weeks later, Merid's purse is discovered along a road south of Morgantown. Helicopters search the area to no avail. The local press starts a public relations war with the governor and police, who they believe are screwing up the investigation and keeping secrets. On this episode, the bodies of Merid and Karen are finally discovered. A crusading newspaper man is forced into retirement, and the murders take on a decidedly mystical tone. From Chromatic Media in the heart of Morgantown, West Virginia, this is Merid and Karen, the WVU Coed murders. We ended episode 1 with a mysterious letter from Cumberland, Maryland, written to police in a neat, precise script and signed only with a triangle, supposedly giving directions to the bodies.
Proceed 25 miles directly south from the southern line of Morgantown. This will bring you to a wooded forest land. Enter into the forest exactly 1 mile. There are the bodies.
If you go by the newspapers, this was considered a catalyst to get people searching in the right direction. They had already found the purse, they had found a few personal effects, but now you've got this letter saying, here's directions from the southern tip of Morgantown, and you've got this almost assumed idea that whoever's writing this has first-hand information, the bodies really are there. We can't ignore this. We really need to go send people there and at least explore this possibility.
On April 9th, troopers Mitchell and DeQuazy followed the directions in the letter and drove down to, obeying it to the letter as it said to do. They found themselves in downtown Grafton.
They pushed south 1 additional mile, as instructed. The troopers found no bodies, but plenty of wooded forest land. As we've said, this description fits most of the state. Without more specific directions, there was nothing to be done in the area. However, the push by the governor to make progress had contributed to a significant search effort closer to 10 miles south of Morgantown, in the general area where the purse had been located.
And so by April 10th or 11th, there were over 200, 300 West Virginia State troopers, National Guard, plus volunteers. There were a lot of volunteers from the Morgantown area just combing through all that area surrounding, which is very wooded, fairly remote, and, dense. So they're combing through the area looking for anything.
It's during these large searches over the next few days that Merid and Karen's belongings begin to turn up in small, scattered piles.
Merid Malorik's pocketbook.
They found a pill bottle that had Merid Malorik's name on it.
Merid's glasses.
Pink compact in 2 different pieces.
Karen's purse.
A couple of ballpoint pens.
A Ronson gas lighter.
On another pill bottle, it was Karen Farrell's.
Tube of lipstick.
An eyeshadow pencil.
Mascara.
Black clothes brush.
A green headscarf.
Karen Farrell's driver's license was found by a toddler at the base of his driveway.
You get the idea. At this point, almost everyone believed that if the girls were ever found, they would not be alive. Although there was at least one theory that was a little more optimistic.
The idea was the girls had been kidnapped and were throwing things out of the car window to mark their presence so that they would start a trail so they could be found.
But I must add, that was the theory of the county coroner at the time.
Bowers.
William Bowers. And he made that up out of his head. It was never a theory that the police, as far as I can see, ever thought was true. But he said they're throwing it out as like a bread trail. Here we are, follow us. And the items were found 50, 75 feet off the road. I mean, there's no way they were scattered the way he says.
In the midst of these discoveries, the police receive another letter. It is written in the same handwriting as the first, and also signed with a triangle symbol. This one essentially repeats the directions of the first letter, encouraging authorities to continue their search, but adds one detail and a sense of urgency.
Fanning out, you will locate the bodies of the girls, covered over with brush. Look carefully. The animals are now on the move.
A slightly embarrassing note here, the first time I heard the animals are now on the move, I assumed that the letter was referring to the killer or killers as animals, suggesting that they were leaving the region or the state. When I said something out loud that reflected this understanding, Sarah and Jeff pointed out that the author was most likely referring to actual animals, which makes more sense. Remember that Merritt and Karen disappeared in mid-January. The temperature had been fluctuating between cold and freezing, but these letters are being received as the weather's getting warmer. The writer seems to be concerned about the state of the girls' presumably dead bodies, which he believes could be destroyed or dragged away by animals. There was some reason to be worried that the girls would be found at all. In episode 1, we talked about how Governor Moore had ordered the state police, led by Trooper Preston Gooden, to conduct their own investigation concurrent with the Morgantown Police Department. We also related the hearsay story of how when Preston Gooden arrived at the police station for the first time, he saw Merritt's purse just sitting on top of a filing cabinet, not even bagged as evidence.
And he said, "What is that doing there? Is that the purse they found?" And when told, yes, it was. So it belongs to one of those girls that ran away. He apparently hit the roof and was not happy.
This supposed first moment would be echoed throughout the investigation.
The lead investigator for the state police, Preston Gooden, heard about the glasses because he was watching the news and he saw a news report about them. And so they found the glasses 24 plus hours before he heard about them, and nobody had bothered to notify him. The different police task forces weren't communicating at all.
The full extent of the mishandling of this case wouldn't become clear until much later, when Gooden would publicly deliver a scathing list of accusations against nearly every authority figure involved. We'll have more on that in a later episode. By this point, 2 letters had now been received from Triangle, but the police were not the only ones supposedly being contacted. Seemingly out of nowhere, Merritt's roommate, who was instrumental in the petitions for hitchhiking reform and the calls for FBI involvement, also reported receiving a letter.
On March 25th, she received a letter with 12 instructions written on it. And one of the instructions was to say that she should be in charge of the investigation and that the whole task force should be based in Westchester on the 4th floor.
To our knowledge, she never produced the letter for police to see. Not long afterward, she also claimed to receive a phone call in her Westchester dorm room from a man with, quote, some sort of foreign accent. She reported that the man insisted on remaining anonymous, but seemed to know details about the case.
The man who called the dorm would not identify himself, stating that his conversation had to be kept anonymous. And this whole case was possibly connected to the Rita bombing, and that any persons getting information would be at risk of being murdered. So the time she asked the subject if he thought the girls would be found, and he stated this would be very difficult to find them. Their disappearance was all part of a plot, and that they had been separated and they were as much as 30 miles apart. So there is an indication that the police were increasingly skeptical of Merritt's roommate's input.
That's the nicest way to put it.
As I mentioned in episode 1, we extended an invitation to Merritt's roommate to appear on the show. She first contacted me by phone while I was driving to Pittsburgh on unrelated business and seemed very interested in participating in the podcast. Because I was behind the wheel, we set up a time to speak in more detail the next morning. When I called, there was no answer. We haven't heard back from her since. While the state police and a WVU panel of psychiatrists and psychologists were trying to profile Triangle, who still remained unidentified in Cumberland, Maryland, others were looking at suspects closer to home. Two of the first Morgantown residents to be suspected came out of a story of hitchhiking gone awry in the student newspaper, the Daily Athenaeum. The editors at the larger Dominion News, who were already openly critical of the governor and law enforcement in the handling of the case, picked up the story and ran with it. For some context here, in the middle of the road just outside of WVU's Student Union building is a thin median strip. Hitchhikers often hailed rides here, and that median is called Grumble Island.
Candace Bales and Cindy Smith claimed that they were on Grumble Island, and they were picked up by two males, Gene Tritchler, Richard Johnson, in like a 64 or 65 red GTO. And they took them out of town, like towards Star City, and the girls claimed that they asked to be let out, and they were refusing them. So one of the guys had to stop, he had to pee, he told the other guy to get out with him, and the girls jetted out the doors and broke a bottle over one of their heads and hitchhiked their way back into the dorms.
And then they probably wanted to just forget the whole thing, except they told somebody and the rumor got out.
That last voice you heard there is Ray Evans, who was a reporter with the Dominion News during the search for Merritt and Karen. He says that to understand how the paper covered the Coeds, you have to understand its general manager, William A. Towns.
William A. Towns, the publisher of the paper, who had been there since 1965, Towns had started out at the age of 14 working as a newspaper boy and working in a newspaper in Oklahoma. He'd worked 14 years for the Cleveland Press. And he became a sort of a troubleshooter for the big boys. Whenever they had a paper that had a lot of problems, they sent him, you're the guy to fix things. Well, fixing things in the newspaper business generally means getting circulation and advertising. He was a stern kind of a guy that believed in community journalism. He believed in justice and representing the people. I mean, he was a crusading journalist. In the crusading era, that was the way to make money in the newspaper, was to go out and actually go after things. It was a combative, confrontational attitude with the cops, with the politicians too,
Ray says that Towns was a crusader, but also a bulldog in his tenacity and dedication to the stories he directed his reporters to cover.
He would hammer a story. He and the newspaper didn't just take that attitude on the Coed case, they took it on every single thing that we dealt with. When Loretta got bombed, front page story, and a jump page that had full pictures, like when they found the Coed's bodies. The next day, Towns just blasted. It was a front page story and 9 inside stories. 9. I mean, this kind of blowout coverage of things for a newspaper with 11,000 circulation and 2 full-time reporters. I mean, he was after a story every day on what's new with the Coeds. The coverage was just instantaneous and heavy, and he didn't let up.
So when Towns got hold of the story of Tritchler and Johnson kidnapping and frightening 2 Coeds, the Dominion News conducted their own interview with the girls. After hearing their story, publishing an article wasn't going to be enough for Towns. Believing that Tritchler and Johnson could possibly be Merritt and Karen's abductors, he convinced them to file a warrant against the driver of the car that very day.
Mr. Towns came in and told me to take these girls down to the magistrate's office, and I told him that I didn't think that was a very good thing to do, that we were more or less kind of crossing a line in the journalism business to be escorting people to get warrants filled out. And he didn't object to my position on that. He just turned around and he did it, The girls were picked up. They were taken down to the office of magistrate, I believe. They filled out a warrant, and the guys were arrested.
And they actually called up Gene Tritchler, and he came in on his own, and he's like, that's not what happened.
The morning after Town's meeting with the girls, the front page banner headline of the Dominion News read, Coed's Tell of Hitchhiking Ordeal. The smaller headline, just above the story, Warrant Accuses Local Man. Tritchler and Johnson fought back.
They ended up actually suing the newspaper for $200,000 for defamation. They tried to sue for $1 million, but the jury awarded them $200,000. It was on loss of reputation and loss of wages. The girls eventually retracted it.
And they said that they would not have filled out the warrant had it not been for the newspaper contacting them and bringing them down there. So we're laying the whole deal on the newspaper. And they said, well, they didn't really harm us. If anything, they hit this guy on the head with a bottle.
This case is more legally complicated than we have time to go into. Ray claims that some of the arguments revolved around the legal definition of the word kidnapping. The article on which the case hinged included the girls' entire account, but omitted Tritchler and Johnson's names. Perhaps the most interesting part details how the girls conducted their own investigation into the incident. When they were picked up, the girls had noticed that Tritchler and Johnson were wearing employee uniforms for a local business. They called and managed to find out Tritchler's last name. They found his home telephone number by calling matching names in the phone book. They spotted Johnson driving around town and began to follow him, saying he, quote, seemed rather shook by the whole thing. They stalked the two, in every sense of the word. Sarah thinks that all this effort is evidence that they were telling the truth, at least about having been frightened. Otherwise, why bother? Ray managed to avoid this whole mess by politely declining involvement, but he still seems baffled by how Towns, who he obviously respects a great deal, ended up with the short end of the stick here.
The guy thinks there's a suspect. We ought to get this guy in there and check him out. And he's guilty. And the guys walk free. Towns gets sued in the newspaper for malicious prosecution, and the alleged kidnappers get absolutely zero except $200,000 later on. That whole thing just amazed me. And in fact, it amazed the circuit court judge because he threw the thing out. And then it was appealed to the state Supreme Court, and the state Supreme Court overruled the circuit court judge.
After the state Supreme Court confirmed that the paper had lost the case, Towns left the newspaper and the newspaper business altogether.
Well, you go lose a $200,000 suit in a paper with 11,000 circulation is a really good reason to retire.
Another early lead in the case centered around a rock band called Ezra.
Joe Turner, right?
Joe Turner.
Joe Turner was in Ezra. He's later famous for being in other bands, including Deep Purple. But at the time, they had found out that the girls had gone to see a show. I think it was at Castle Club.
Yeah, it was at Castle two weeks in a row. That was the second week. And it was the Ezra band was from New Jersey, and apparently Merritt knew them.
Well, they said they saw someone that looked
sure.
like Merritt talking to some of the band members at the hotel.
Right.
And then it was in New Jersey where they had been prior that there had been two Coeds, both 19, stabbed to death and found not too far off the Garden State Parkway. They didn't really think that the band was responsible, but they thought, well, maybe it was someone who was traveling with the band or someone who was a big fan. Turns out, like, those two girls that died in New Jersey was never solved, but it is suspected that it was one of Ted Bundy's earlier crimes. I think they pretty much cleared the band. I think there was enough different from the crimes, like those girls weren't decapitated. They were stabbed to death. Merritt and Karen weren't stabbed to death like that. I mean, it was brutal. One of the girls died because she had like a punctured lung, and like one of them was, they said partially decapitated, but I think she'd just been cut in the neck. It wasn't the same, as their heads were never found.
As with many other leads in the case, all of the early people of interest were dismissed as pressure to find Merritt and Karen mounted, and they would soon be found. It was 88 days after their disappearance, less than a week after the massive search parties began combing the area, that their bodies were discovered, 30 feet from a creek bank, covered in brush and stone, decomposing and headless.
didn't realize they drew a map on there.
Yep, little diagram. And you can see how precise it is.
Edge of woodland in West Virginia.
Yes, edge of woodland.
I know where the woods start.
Woodland, right by the Shire.
Jeff, Sarah, her fiancé Eric, and I head south out of Morgantown on Interstate 79, just a few miles, toward the place where the bodies of Merritt and Karen were discovered. We turn onto Goshen Road, then onto a smaller, winding one-lane. It's so narrow that if someone had been driving the other way, we would have had to pull off the road to let them pass, but there's no traffic to speak of.
The way this would have been different, in 1970, this was all, there was no interstate, first of all. This was all hills and trees, essentially, with a whole veiny network of logging roads and mining roads and so forth, that we can travel on a few of those that are still like that. And this is, see how this road goes with the curves, and this was the main road.
It's a beautiful road. At the moment, anyway.
Yeah, well, it's okay. This is it. This is the creek. This is when they say they take it from the river, the rocks from the river. This is it. So, as you can tell, it's not much of a river. The place we're going is right in there.
Some looking left.
And you want to go, just pull over somewhere.
Oh, okay. We park in a pull-off area near the site, and Jeff leads us into a small, man-made meadow. To our left, we can hear the creek, which snakes ahead of us between the rising hills that surround us on three sides. Muddy tire treads are worn into the ground, visible only by the lack of grass, wildflowers, and other flora that covers everything else. Vehicles apparently still pull into the area occasionally, probably trucks or ATVs, given the terrain.
We're pretty much there. Really right here. Those pictures, you remember those pictures?
Mm-hmm.
And you can kind of see...
I can bring them up on my phone.
Can you?
If I have a signal. Probably spoke too soon. Okay, here's a picture of the creek.
Large stones dot the meadow floor, much like the ones that partially covered the bodies. In fact, to the best of our knowledge, the stones were never removed. Some of them, I realize, may have actually been resting on the girls. And it looks like those are pretty large slabs, like they're not just like, a stone you pick up out of the creek. That looks like a heavy piece of rock.
Yeah, it's about the size of a tombstone, it looks like.
Well, yeah, what you see, I mean, it's not so much here, but in a lot of places there's just stones on the...
Here's there was a tree with a knot hole, which is probably what I recognize the most from the photos.
Yeah, that's this one.
Yeah.
And then they were found kind of back and to the right.
We examined the photographs that were taken as the headless bodies of Merritt and Karen were being carefully uncovered and carted away on stretchers. There's one that is rather gruesome, which I hadn't seen before standing where the photo was taken.
Here's a better image of
Police dismantle the...
Will you zoom that in for me? I can't.
Sure. It won't go very far, but...
That's okay. Jesus.
That's how it was found.
The bodies were found fully clothed, both on their bellies, with Karen on top of Merritt at an angle such that their chests were directly on top of each other, with their feet sticking in slightly different directions. They were covered with brush and a few large stones, all of which were under a fallen tree that sort of forked into the air over them. Having been more exposed for 3 months, Karen took the brunt of the decay. In the more graphic photo, her coccyx bone can be seen starting to show through her rotting clothes.
Now, how far is it from here to the road, you figure?
I'm pretty terrible with spatial guesses.
And you?
100 yards?
Yeah, I was going to say 300 or 400 feet, so yeah, 100 yards.
This is, the police records say 296 feet from the road. So I'm thinking it was right here.
I asked Jeff to consider what might have been different about the location when the murders happened.
There had been severe storms. That's a key point, I guess. In December of '69, there were severe storms around north central West Virginia, and rivers all over the northern part of the state flooded. So the creek was probably fairly high.
In addition to the changes made by the storms in the spring of 1970, the passage of time was also evident from the images in our hands. The creek's ever-changing placement now put it further from the point where the bodies had been found, as if it were turning away from the memory. Trees and the black and white photographs had fallen and been replaced with younger versions. For us, Merritt and Karen's resting place seemed a still, horrible center around which the meadow had evolved.
Some people said because of that big tree that was over the bodies that it had to take two people because to lift that tree. And I was just telling her, Richard and I, that tree was still here when I first came out here. And it's the same tree that's in the forked tree that's in those photos. It would have taken two people to lift the tree, but if it fell right there, it wouldn't, one guy could just push it over. I think it looked to me like it was makeshift. People, whoever did this, just put and then said, "Oh, I better cover it with some stuff," and just sort of did that and then left. And so I've always kind of discounted that. Well, that rock would be too big for a small guy to carry from the creek. Well, yeah, that's true. I mean, that could have been kids come out here, drink some beer and party, and made a little pile.
Build a bench or a makeshift bench or something.
Yeah, that could well be too.
Yeah, I mean, those stones might have been around a fire pit or something. It could have been something that was really easy to roll out.
Or another alternative is if it was someone who said to Merritt and Karen, "Hey, you want to go get high?" And both of them were kind of up for that, so they said, "Sure, I know a place." Yeah, I mean, there's all kinds of explanations possible. I mean, I don't know that there's much else to see.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't expect there to be. I just wanted to...
You wanted to hear Jeff say, "If I did it."
Yeah.
This is how I was.
If I did it, I was a fearsome 9-year-old, I'll tell you.
Walking through the woods with my friends and gold, and we don't mind the cold smoking, laughing about how things work out, how it seems like we're always failing, but these leaves beneath our feet won't cushion us from this branch we're falling. How we'll find.
So this next part of the story may sound staged, but it's not. When Sarah and I were talking about things to include in this story, one thing she suggested was going out and talking to people who were around at the time just to get a sense of what their memories of the event were so long after it happened, sort of a person on the street vibe. But where to find people who were around in 1970? Well, the WVU Creative Arts Center had an upcoming stage production of Saturday Night Fever, the musical. So we figure that the fact that the film came out in 1977, paired with the expense of the tickets, there's a high probability that the audience will be comprised mostly of baby boomers. So what happens if we just stand in front of the building before the show and approach folks who look 60 or older? Maybe not the best plan ever devised, I'll grant you that, but then this happened. About 20 minutes before the start of the show, a tall, older man with a full head of hair that was not quite completely silver, dressed in black pants and a crisp button-down shirt, was advancing toward the entrance. Accompanying him were two women with curled platinum hair, also dressed nicely for the occasion. The trio looked to be the right age range for our survey. When we approached the group and asked them if they remember Merritt and Karen, the tall man, who we eventually learn is named Rod Everly, says, "Yeah, one of the guys in my squad found them."
Yeah, one of the guys in my squad found them.
Yeah?
Yeah, I was in the National Guard.
You weren't in on the search?
What's that?
You weren't in on the search?
Yeah, I was in on the search.
So you were actually out there looking for the bodies?
Yeah, we found them. One of the guys in my squad found them.
Wow. I should apologize for the quality of the audio here. There are people milling about, traffic in the distance. To make matters worse, the two women who were with Rod are totally uninterested in anything he has to say or anything that we have to ask him, and they carry on conversation right beside us, sort of constantly throwing looks and hints that they're ready to get inside. But, I can't really blame them. We were sort of imposing on their night. Anyway, this is how the conversation went. So you were like in a squad, like a different section searching when your buddy was right there?
And they got a letter that said it's 27.1 miles out of Morgantown, and they find the bodies. And we searched down there at Witten Mine. There were places you could drop a body.
Yeah.
You know, you'd listen for a couple minutes before you hit the body. Whoever killed him was watching everything that was going on. And I told my guys, my squad, to go up on this strip mine. And of course, you always got one guy that doesn't do what he's supposed to. So he started up to the strip mine, and then he dropped down over the hill and went across the creek, sit down on these logs, smoked a cigarette. And when he sat down on the logs, this girl's leg was sticking out of the logs.
So he wasn't even supposed to be there, and he sat on top of the tomb structure to have a cigarette.
Wow.
And he let out a scream, and Steve Slavinsky was one that found him. Whoever did it was all about triangle, you know, the area was a triangle, the bodies were covered with the logs in a triangle.
You'll notice that he got some of the mileage wrong here. The letters from Triangle said to search 26 miles south of Morgantown, not 27.1. But after more than 45 years, it would be understandable to confuse 25 plus 1 with 27.1. We know that the person who discovered the bodies was indeed one Steve Slavinsky, but we didn't have time to dig any deeper. Rod's dates for the evening whisked him inside. I tried to contact him on Facebook for a proper interview, but I don't think he uses it very often, and he hasn't responded to my messages. Also notice that the legacy of Triangle has been preserved in his retelling. The letters, after all, had been correct, in that the bodies had been found covered with brush south of Morgantown. It would seem that the symbol really stuck out to those who were directly involved with the case.
Okay, well, some people thought that at the time that there were, because the letters were signed with a triangle, that there were a lot of triangles kind of mysteriously surrounding this case.
Honestly, I don't really see a triangle in the construction of the logs or pile of debris that covered the girls' bodies, but we're posting several photos taken at the site for you to check out for yourself. Of course, it's easy to see triangles when you're looking for them. I'm willing to bet you can glance around your room or out the window of your car and find several right this moment, but it wasn't all imagination. There really was some creepy Blair Witch shit out in those woods.
Some people had reported some weird things that they had found in the woods. We had search parties out there by that time. This was before anything was found, but people were saying, hey, we found weird things that were made out of rocks in the woods.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there was apparently a sighting of someone found a rock, stones made into a triangle, and in the middle of that triangle was a stick with a burlap bag suspended from it, a small burlap bag, like a bindle stiff. No one seems to know what that was or what it was doing there. There was a copper plate found with a lot of mystical symbols, astrological symbols, and Greek writing and various things, and some spooky eyes with
weird eyebrows.
Weird eyebrows that made it look like Satan.
Okay, time out. After this initial interview was recorded, Sarah showed it to a friend of hers who's familiar with pagan symbolism.
When she saw the plate, instead of seeing eyebrows, she said, no, those look like antlers. And the stag is a very popular symbol that is associated with virility. And there's actually a circle with sort of a cross in it. It's very symmetrical. And she said that that kind of resembled a crosshair to her, and that possibly the person who designed the plate was doing so in order to hunt down this stag and bring prosperity or virility or whatever the stag represented to them. I think the problem is when it comes to paganism, it's like programming, and everybody does it in a different way, and everybody uses different symbols. So the way that I would write code wouldn't be the same way as someone else would write code, but we're going to base it off of a similar alphabet. And it'll do the same thing, but with the different steps that we've given it. And she said that was a pretty good analogy for paganism and the rituals, that everybody has their own personal take on it.
Now that she says that, we can totally see how it could be antlers. You can see and decide for yourself online at our website, which we'll share at the end of the program. Okay, time in.
And there were an 8-pointed star and a 6-pointed star, I think. And there were just a mishmash of mystical symbols. hand carved into a copper plate.
Didn't they say that two of the things they were able to translate, one was the word logic and one was the word Coptic?
Yes, and another one was the word opera. But there was a magic square, which is a term from mysticism, supposedly going back to the days of alchemy, where letters forming a square, 4 or 5 letters long, and the words, it says certain magic words when they're read up and down and diagonally and so forth.
There were triangle symbols on that copper plate, correct?
I'm not sure.
Yeah, there's a triangle there.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they're probably letters, but it's definitely a triangle.
Rumors about mystical involvement in cults, because of the Manson thing happening, the Zodiac thing happening on the West Coast. There's a murder of a guy's whole family, supposedly by hippies that were tripping and chanting mystical symbols and waving candles. So yeah, mystical murder was on the minds of everybody around the country. It was very big at the time, and that probably is why everyone just sort of jumped right to that as an explanation for what was going on here. Plus the beheading part.
Oh yeah, it's a little less scary if it's a ritual rather than, some sex-crazed pervert.
I put all my money down on the last horse out the gate. And when they laid the hammer down.
We're here on University Avenue, where at one time back in the 70s, I worked in a place called the Snacks, which was right here in this brick building here.
In episode 1, we promised to bring back Ron Rittenhouse, the photojournalist who was on the scene of the Loretta bombing assassination attempt. The building we're standing beside, now occupied by a sandwich shop and a head shop, is a center of student traffic, and just down the hill from Merritt and Cared's dorm. Ron worked as a photojournalist during the day.
Then I came over about 4:30 to 5 o'clock, and I worked here at Snacks. And Snacks was a little place that sold peanuts, chips, beer, sodas, and things like that. There's a lot of traffic that came up through here, going to the different WVU dorms, and this is where I first had the acquaintance of meeting the 2 girls that were the Coeds. They came in probably once or twice, maybe sometimes 3 times a week, just stopping by, maybe in there for 5 or 10 minutes at the most. As most people come in, get what they needed, and leave, but they would come in and they would kind of, talk and giggle and maybe a nice day and just general conversation, nothing personal or anything like that. Right off the bat, I had no idea that it was the same girls, and then as things developed, then I said, wow, I see these girls, I knew these girls. They passed by here, they came in here.
Other than Merritt's roommate, Ron is the only person still around who we know actually interacted with Merritt and Karen on any sort of regular basis. He was also there the day that the girls' bodies were discovered. It started with a phone call.
Hey, I don't know what's going on, but it's a bunch of National Guardsmen out here looking like they're searching for something. There was a big open area to the right. Turned in there and parked, and there was people searching all around. I don't remember any search dogs at that time, but a lot of people there. More than I'd ever seen in one bunch searching. So I was there just kind of following guys around. No one would say anything. You'd ask the question, it was like, if they knew me, well, sorry, Ron, can't talk to you, But after about a half hour, I was following this one guy, and then I looked up. Everybody was getting in their vehicles, leaving. And so I kind of said, well, something's going on.
When he got to the area where the vehicles were parked, the road was blocked off, but being a journalist, he just parked nearby and began walking up and over one of the hills in the area.
I'd gotten back right to the area where you can, with the right lens, you can look down. Of course, all you could see was just a bunch of tree limbs and woods, and you could see a few people standing around. And probably 15, 20 minutes, I heard this speaker, saying, "Ron, we know you're up there. Come on down. What's going on here? What did I do?" First thing I know, the trooper, Cunningham, was standing right beside me and said, "You have to leave. You have to leave right now. Give me your film." So, I've been working a year. I'm scared to death. "Oh, okay." Pulled the film out of the camera and I gave him the film. They escorted me down to the car, drove me back up out to the head of the road there, told me to leave and not to come back.
This was around 1 p.m. He had managed to get a few photos of the searchers standing by the pile of brush and stone under which the bodies were lying when he reported back to the Dominion News that his film had been confiscated. Managing editor Mickey Farfari, who had already been feuding with authorities along with Towns about the investigation, was very unhappy. The next morning, Farfari published a detailed editorial in his own words about the day. According to that account, more than an hour after Ron's film was taken and he was forced out of the area, Dominion reporter Jim Stacy arrived and was also barred from the scene, along with other reporters. Farfari then drove to the blockade himself, demanding access to the scene and demanding Ron's film be returned. He was told that only Captain Bowley of the state police could make a decision on these matters, but Captain Bowley couldn't be located. In his own words,
"Now it was pushing toward 3 p.m., or more than 3 hours after the bodies had been found, and the patience of this newsman was wearing thin. Local radio stations with mobile units there wanted me to go on the air and voice the complaints. I declined because I was more interested in getting the barrier lifted and in retrieving the confiscated film."
He then drove to a phone booth to call the state police superintendent's office in Charleston, West Virginia's capital city. 8 to 10 minutes later, Captain Bowley showed up. He told the assembled reporters that they would be allowed to see where the bodies had been found only after they had been removed. The photos that we've been looking through decades later were taken by the primary photographer working with the state police. Ron did eventually get his film back that day.
But, when I came back, processed the film, it was all black. So they pulled it out, exposed it, and so there was nothing there.
Farfari's editorial closed by saying,
"Local news media have been disturbed by Governor R.J. Moore's obvious attempts at managing the news in this bizarre, brutal murder case. I got the impression from talking to some members of the state police that they, too, aren't happy with the situation. Indeed, it seemed a sad commentary on the times when a newsman has to telephone 225 miles away to find out what's going on within his own county."
Pardon the next bit of audio here as I was off mic, but as the interview with Ron Rittenhouse ended, Sarah and Jeff asked if I had any more questions for him. I guess maybe just one. If the same thing had happened, say, last week, do you think you would have turned your film over?
No. Nope. He would have had to have something to show me that he had the authority, or maybe like a warrant today if they were coming to your house, but no way would I turn that film over.
It was a combination of your inexperience and the intimidation of this officer.
So I would have went out kicking and screaming before I turned loose my camera or film.
The next day, the Dominion News would begin its blowout coverage of the Coed story, but it was a different newspaper, the Charleston Gazette, that grabbed the attention of law enforcement. There on the front page was a photograph of the gravesite. The bodies had already been removed. There was only one person in the photograph. A bearded man in jeans and a button-down shirt stood, awkwardly pointing to the darkened spot on the forest floor where the bodies had been lying. The caption referred to the man as unidentified member of search party, but no one seemed to recognize him. That's all for episode 2 of Merritt and Karen, the WVU Coed murders. Coming up in episode 3, police investigate the man standing over the Coed's gravesite. Compassionate volunteering or returning to the scene of the crime? Also, Triangle is finally revealed, and we speak to a WVU hitchhiker who lived in the dorm room right above Merritt, who was called in to sketch a suspect after a truly shady encounter. This show is a passion project of Chromatic Media. All episodes are free and without advertising. Check our website at chromatic.media, that's KROMATIC.media, for all episodes, photographs, old newspaper clippings, links to the music and musicians, and more. If you enjoyed the show, take 2 seconds to rate it on your podcasting service to help other listeners find good stuff. Married and Karen is produced by myself and Sarah Gibbons, with lots of assistance from Jeff Fuller. Our theme song, which you can hear right now, and other instrumentals throughout the show, are written and performed by John Smithers, Nick Larson, and Annie Stroud. Those tracks were produced by Nathan Snyder. All the music you hear in our episodes is written and recorded by Morgantown musicians. First up this episode, we had All I Have from Humans, Etc. Beyond the Wall of Sleep from Ordo Templi Sonica. Lost in the Woods from Ghost House.
Walking through the woods with my friends of gold, and we don't mind the cold smoking.
And finally, Hammer Down from False Pterodactyl. The Letter from Triangle was voiced by Justin Groh. Special thanks to our guests, Ray Evans and Ron Rittenhouse. On the next episode, a psychic cult. And looking beyond, we have a parade of horrible human beings, all suspects, until someone finally goes to trial for the crime. Stay tuned.
Second place, so I shot him in the face. I didn't even hesitate. I just laid the hammer down. No time to contemplate. Just laid the hammer down. Roll the dice and test the fate. I just laid the hammer down. I did it all without the hate. I just laid the hammer down.